Story number 1. 15 years ago, the district attorney in our town decided to take the day off. That morning, he called his girlfriend, told her he was skipping work, and said, "I love you." She thought it was sweet but strange. He wasn't the type to take a random day off, especially without a reason. He didn't mention plans, just told her he'd be out for a while and hung up. Later that morning, people saw him drive his black sedan into town. He parked on the main street, right in front of a diner where he usually grabbed breakfast on busy days. The car sat there all day. A waitress even noticed it was still parked by the time her evening shift started. But no one thought anything of it at first. People come and go. It's not unusual for a car to sit for a few hours. Witnesses remember seeing him walk along the sidewalk, his coat slung over one arm, stopping in front of a couple of stores. Some say he looked like he was window shopping, while others claim he seemed lost in thought, staring through the glass but not really seeing anything. He waved to the bookstore owner as he passed, but he never went inside. No one remembers him talking to anyone or making plans. That was the last time anyone saw him. When the morning came and his car was still sitting on the curb, the police got involved. At first it looked ordinary. Locked doors, no signs of a struggle. But inside the car, things got strange. His phone was lying on the passenger seat, untouched. There were no recent calls or texts after that conversation with his girlfriend, but his wallet and keys were missing, as if he had only taken what he thought he needed. The police checked security cameras from the surrounding stores, hoping for a clue, but all they caught were brief glimpses of him walking by. There was no sign of him leaving town, no footage of him getting into another vehicle. He had simply walked out of view and disappeared. Weeks later, a search team combed the nearby woods and rivers, looking for anything, a jacket, a shoe, any sign of where he could have gone. Nothing turned up. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Then months later, someone found his laptop under a bridge, hidden in the weeds at the edge of the riverbank. When the police opened the laptop, they found that the hard drive was missing. They searched the area around the bridge but couldn't find it. It was as if whoever had taken it didn't want anyone to know what was on it. For a while, people thought the trail had gone cold. But a few months after that, a woman out for a morning walk found something half buried in the mud along the riverbank. It was the missing hard drive. The cops tried to recover the data, but it was too far gone. Water had soaked through the metal, and rust had eaten away at the circuits. Whatever was on that drive was lost forever. It could have held answers, or maybe just useless files, but no one would ever know. And then came the final, chilling clue. While going through his home computer, investigators found a strange search in the browser history. How to wreck a hard drive. That's when the theory started. Some say he must have jumped from the bridge, ending it all, and tossed the hard drive to cover something up before he did it. Others believe he ran into someone he had put behind bars, someone with a grudge and a plan. But the strangest theory of all is that he planned everything. That he got tired of his life, erased whatever was on that hard drive, and walked away to start fresh somewhere far away, under a new name. Whatever the truth is, no one ever found a body. No new leads have surfaced in 15 years. His girlfriend still hopes he's out there somewhere, but even she admits it feels like holding on to a ghost. People in town still whisper about him from time to time, especially when they pass the spot where his car sat, locked and waiting. And every time I walk by that bridge, I think about the hard drive. What was so important that he, or someone else, destroyed it? Story number 2. I don't know if you'd call this a dark secret, but it's one of the craziest things that ever happened in the county where I lived from age 10 to 18. We had a soldier die under some seriously strange circumstances, and to this day, a lot of people, including his family, don't believe the official story. The way it goes is that he was supposedly high, drunk, or experiencing some kind of mental breakdown when he ended up at a nursery. Not a child care center, but the kind that sells plants. The police claimed he ransacked the place, ate some pizza he found, took a bit of money from the register, and then freaked out when he was stung by a swarm of wasps. According to their story, that's what made him panic and run out into the night. But that's where things start getting weird. On his way out, he called 911, multiple times. Each time he told the dispatcher that someone was chasing him. He was terrified, saying they were trying to kidnap him, that they wouldn't stop following him. You can hear it in his voice. This wasn't just some drunk guy rambling. He was genuinely scared for his life. Then during the final call, something changed. He told the dispatcher that everything was fine now. His tone had completely shifted, like he wasn't worried anymore. But here's the part that still gives me chills. Right before the call ended, you can hear another male voice in the background. It's faint, but it's there, clear enough to make out the words, "Tell her." Less than 15 minutes after that final call, he was hit by a car on a nearby road. The driver, a woman, immediately stopped and called 911. But while they were waiting for help to arrive, 2 more cars came speeding down the road and ran him over. He died there on the pavement. None of the other drivers stopped. When the autopsy report came out, it added even more questions. There were no traces of wasp or bee stings on his body, despite the police saying he'd been swarmed at the nursery. And then there was the scene itself. Inside the nursery, his phone and wallet were just sitting there on the counter, untouched, as if he had placed them there deliberately. But the weirdest part? No fingerprints, no footprints, no DNA anywhere in the building could be tied back to him. It was like he had never been there at all, despite the police saying he was responsible for the break-in. The official explanation didn't sit right with his family from the start. They knew he wasn't from this part of the state and had mentioned in text that he was having trouble with some of the local guys. Apparently, things had gotten heated between them in the days leading up to his death. So his family hired a private investigator to dig deeper, and that's when things got even more unsettling. The investigator reviewed the 911 calls and found something strange. Background noises in nearly all of them. You couldn't make out most of it, but in several parts you could hear multiple voices talking. And in that last call, when the soldier suddenly claimed everything was fine, you could clearly hear the male voice telling him, "Tell her." The PI's findings only fueled the family's suspicions. They believed the story the police told was a cover-up, something to protect the local guys who had been messing with him. The theory is that they ran him down after a fight and forced him to make that final call, telling the dispatcher everything was fine so it wouldn't raise any alarms. When he got a chance, he must have bolted again, running down the road hoping to get away. That's when the first car hit him. But here's where things get even darker. Of the 3 drivers who ran him over, only the first woman stopped and called for help. None of the other drivers were charged, not even a ticket. And when people started digging, they found out that one of the drivers had connections to the police department, either family ties or close friendships with some of the officers. That was when the cover-up theories really started gaining traction. The more you look into it, the harder it is to ignore how shady the whole thing is. The police never provided a satisfying explanation for why his phone and wallet were left behind in the nursery, untouched. They never explained the lack of physical evidence tying him to the scene, even though they insisted he had been there. And the fact that none of the other drivers were held accountable, despite killing a man in the road, only makes things worse. A lot of people in town think the police were involved in covering it up. Small-town departments aren't exactly known for being squeaky clean, and there have been rumors for years about officers looking the other way when their friends or family are involved in something serious. Some people even say the department has covered up worse: rapes, assaults, things that never made it into the public record. Story number 3. There's a story in our town about a wealthy man from the 1600s, some say early 1700s, who had more money than sense. He lived alone in a grand house on the edge of town, surrounded by land and barns, and everyone knew he was a little eccentric. But what made him truly infamous was the strange plan he came up with for his burial after seeing something that disturbed him late one night. It started when he saw grave robbers digging up a freshly buried body in the local cemetery. Instead of being horrified like most people would be, it made him obsess over what might happen to his own body after he died. He couldn't stand the idea of ending up like that poor soul, dug up and stolen. In his mind, there was only one way to make sure no one would ever touch his grave. He wouldn't have one. Before he eventually passed away, he ordered that his body not be buried in a cemetery, but instead be laid to rest in the roof of the barn behind his house. Yes, the roof. This wasn't just paranoia. He had planned it all down to the last detail. The coffin was to be sealed tight and the barn locked from the outside. No one was allowed inside, not family, not visitors, until he came back. You see, this man had an even stranger belief. He was convinced that death wasn't permanent, at least not for him. He believed he would only be gone for 30 years, like he was just taking a long nap. And when the time came for his resurrection, he wanted to be ready. He told his family that they had to put the only key to the barn inside his coffin. That way, when he woke up, he could unlock the door himself, but no one else could disturb his rest in the meantime. But that wasn't all. His will had another odd condition. Whoever inherited his house, land, and fortune would be required to return everything to him when he resurrected. No questions asked. If they didn't, he warned, they would be cursed for life. Amazingly, his family went along with it. Maybe they were afraid of him, or maybe they figured there was no harm in honoring the wishes of a dead man, so they followed his instructions exactly. They laid his body in the barn's roof, locked the doors, and placed the key in his coffin. His estate was passed down, but with the understanding that one day it would all belong to him again. For a while, the barn just sat there, untouched and locked. It became a kind of local curiosity. Some people thought the whole thing was ridiculous. Others believed it was cursed. Nobody really knew what to make of it, but one thing was certain. No one dared go inside. His descendants held on to the property, but they kept their distance from the barn. It was like a strange, looming reminder of the man's obsession with life after death. Years passed, then decades. Of course, he never came back. The barn, once sturdy and well-kept, began to rot. Shingles peeled off the roof, and the wood beams sagged under the weight of time. But even as it decayed, the doors stayed locked, and the key stayed buried with him, just as he had planned. At some point, curiosity got the better of someone. Maybe it was teenagers on a dare, or maybe it was just someone too curious for their own good. Whoever it was, they found a way inside. The doors were forced open, and when they climbed up to the roof, they found his coffin. When they opened it, the skeleton inside was still intact, the key resting where it had been placed all those years ago. But instead of honoring his final wishes, they took his bones and scattered them. Some say they sold them to collectors. Others believe the bones were just tossed away, buried somewhere no one would ever find them. Either way, they were gone. With the bones missing, the barn lost whatever strange mystique it once held. People stopped caring about it, and it was eventually torn down. As for the grand house where he had lived, that didn't fare much better. Time passed, and the property changed hands over and over until it was finally renovated and turned into a dentist's office. Every now and then, someone will bring it up. Hey, you know that dentist's office used to be owned by a guy who thought he'd come back from the dead, right? And just like that, the whole story comes out again, told with the same disbelief and amusement as always. It's a weird little piece of local history, and no one really knows what to make of it. Story number 4. About 10 years ago, our town went through a brutal crime wave. It wasn't just the usual uptick in petty thefts or gang fights. This was a full-blown cartel war. One cartel tried to push the other out of the area, and because we're just across the border from the US, our town was prime real estate. At first, it was chaos in the streets, shootouts, ambushes, bodies left in the open as warnings. But as time went on, the violence changed. It became quieter, more controlled. Instead of street fights, rivals started vanishing. People would be here one day and the next they were gone. The ones who were taken never came back. Those bodies didn't turn up, no funerals, nothing. The missing cartel members were being abducted, interrogated, and disposed of without a trace. Eventually, one cartel won. They took full control of the town, forcing their rivals out and reestablishing order. The streets went quiet again, but not in a good way. It was the kind of quiet where everyone knew what had happened, even if no one dared to say it out loud. What baffled the authorities wasn't just the violence, but how stealthy the whole thing had been. Cartels are usually flashy, bloody shootouts in broad daylight, making sure everyone knows who's in charge. But this time, it was different. Their operations were surgical. They struck with precision and vanished before anyone could react. The scale of it didn't add up either. Sure, a small unit or lone hitman could move like that, but an entire cartel? It was impossible. These guys had weapons, vehicles, places to sleep, kitchens to feed their people. metal shops to modify guns, and equipment to dispose of bodies. The operation had to be massive, yet the federal investigations turned up nothing. They searched everywhere: ranches, warehouses, junkyards, abandoned factories. They combed through the outskirts and followed every rumor, but there was no sign of a headquarters, no base of operations, no sign of where they kept their men or stashed their supplies. Nothing. That's when someone finally thought to look somewhere no one had considered before. A few kilometers outside of town, where the state prison sat quietly, fully operational. As it turned out, the prison wasn't just holding inmates, it was the cartel's headquarters. The entire operation had been running from behind those walls, hidden in plain sight. Everyone was in on it. The guards, the inmates, even the warden, hell, even the governor. They had turned the prison into a fortress, fully equipped with dorms, weapons storage, workshops, and kitchens. The metal shop where they modified guns was right under the guards' noses. And when it came time to get rid of the bodies, they dissolved them in acid. They used metal drums, the kind you see in industrial settings, and dumped the remains in a nearby river. For years, people vanished into that prison and were never seen again. Rivals who had been taken off the streets ended up in those acid barrels, their identities wiped clean. There were no traces, no bodies left behind, just empty cells and rivers polluted with the ghosts of the cartel's enemies. When the authorities finally pieced it together, it was too late. The cartel had already won, and the people who made it happen, those guards, the warden, even the governor, had slipped away. The prison operation was shut down, but the damage was done. The governor, the one who helped orchestrate the entire scheme, is now a wanted man, on the run with an international warrant hanging over his head. Interpol has been after him for years, but he's managed to disappear, just like those bodies in the barrels. Some people say he's hiding out somewhere in South America. Others think he's been protected by friends still loyal to the cartel. Our town has never really recovered. Sure, the streets are quieter now, but there's always a sense of unease. The prison still stands, though it's been shut down for years. People say the air around it smells wrong, like chemicals in decay, no matter how far the river flows. Story number 5. A few years back, a friend of mine decided to run for mayor in his town. It wasn't a huge place, maybe around 4,000 people, but it was the sister city to a larger town across the river with a population of about 70,000. That connection gave the mayor's position a bit more weight than usual. Whoever won the election would have a say in budgets, development projects, and cross-city policies. My friend was well-liked and seemed like a solid candidate. He thought it would be a fair fight, but things got weird fast. Not long after he announced his campaign, strange things started happening. He noticed the police had taken a sudden interest in him. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, an officer driving by his house now and then. But it wasn't just once or twice. They drove by every hour like clockwork, day and night. Sometimes they'd park across the street, just sitting there, making it clear they were watching him. That wasn't the worst of it. Whenever someone visited his house, the cops would stop by shortly after to run their plates. They even pulled over those visitors later, handing out warnings for minor infractions. It happened to me 5 times in just 2 weeks. Every single time, it was something ridiculous, like not coming to a full stop at a stop sign or failing to signal long enough before a turn. No tickets, just warnings. But it was obvious that the cops were sending a message: stay away from him. The constant police presence made people nervous. Some of his supporters stopped visiting, not wanting to deal with the hassle of getting pulled over every time they came by. My friend was getting frustrated, but he kept telling himself it would blow over. At least that's what he hoped. Then the flyers showed up. They were plastered all over town, on poles and shop windows, even in people's mailboxes. They accused my friend of being corrupt, claiming that he was only running for mayor to steal money from the city. The story they used to back it up was an old scandal from more than 20 years ago, involving a loan given out after a major flood. Back then, the town was hit hard by the flood, and a lot of relief money came in. Part of that money went toward a loan to a group of local business owners who ran a strip of restaurants along the river. The loan was interest-free for 15 years, which was generous. But when the 15 years were up, things got messy. The restaurant owners claimed they had repaid the loan in full, but the town's financial records told a different story. According to the city's books, only a small portion of the loan had been repaid. And when the state got involved, they found something even stranger. The state had no record of receiving any payments from the city. Not even the partial amount that the restaurant owners said they had paid. It was a complete mess. For years, the scandal brewed quietly, with accusations of missing money, corruption, and mismanagement floating around. But no one was ever charged, and the case just faded away, until my friend announced his candidacy. Someone dug up the old story and twisted it into an attack against him. They claimed that my friend had been involved in the scheme through a distant connection. His cousin's wife's sister worked in the city's accounting department, the same department that handled the loan payments. The flyers suggested that my friend and his relative had been working together to embezzle city funds and that he was running for mayor to cover it all up. The accusations were completely baseless, but that didn't matter. The damage was done. People started questioning my friend's intentions. Conversations around town shifted from supporting his campaign to wondering if the rumors were true. The local papers picked up the story, and soon even people who knew him well began to second-guess things. Meanwhile, the police harassment continued. They didn't just stop at pulling people over. There were late-night knocks on his door, random check-ins, and constant surveillance. It was like the entire system had turned against him, working overtime to make sure he knew he wasn't welcome in the race. He held on for as long as he could, determined to see his campaign through. But the pressure was relentless. The flyers kept coming, the police didn't back off, and the media refused to let the scandal go, even though there was no real evidence. His supporters dwindled, too scared to get involved or visit him. Eventually, he had no choice but to drop out of the race. He wasn't willing to drag his family through any more stress or risk losing his reputation entirely. The day he announced he was dropping out, everything stopped. No more police visits, no more pulled-over supporters, no more flyers or accusations. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. It was clear that someone, maybe multiple people, wanted him out of the way. And once he was gone, they had no reason to keep up the pressure. The scandal disappeared just as quickly as it had started, and life in town went back to normal. And the old scandal, still unresolved. The missing money never showed up, the restaurant owners never gave a straight answer, and the city's books remain as murky as ever. But no one talks about it anymore. Just like no one talks about what happened to my friend. Story number 6, I went to a small high school in Appalachia, tucked just off the interstate. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and things didn't change much from year to year. But in the early 2000s, things started to shift when MS-13 tried to move in. Apparently, our little town was a perfect midpoint on their smuggling route for drugs, guns, and even dogs, running shipments up to NYC and DC. We didn't have much of a police presence, and there weren't any real gangs already established. On paper, we were easy pickings. But what the gang didn't realize was that this wasn't just some sleepy town they could take over without a fight. A lot of the kids at my school came from hunting families. These were the kinds of folks who grew up shooting rifles before they learned to ride bikes. For some families, hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was how they put food on the table. Deer season never really ended for them. I remember when I was in school, you could still see the outlines of the old rifle racks on the backs of some classroom walls, where they'd been removed just a few years earlier. At first, it seemed like the gang would slip in quietly. A few members started showing up at parties, trying to recruit. Some of them were selling hard drugs, stuff this town had never seen before. Meth, coke, even heroin. Before long, people started getting hurt. A couple of fights broke out at school, and there were some nasty incidents late at night that no one wanted to talk about in public. It was starting to feel like the gang was making progress. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. Those kids from the old holler families. The moonshine families in the area had been running their own quiet operations for generations. They weren't a formal gang, but they had their own kind of code and everyone knew not to mess with them. A couple of the seniors at school, kids whose families had been in the area for generations, decided enough was enough. They weren't about to let MS-13 move in and take over. These kids arranged a meeting with some of the senior gang members. The plan was simple. Tell them that the town was off limits, They chose a Walmart parking lot in the middle of the night as the meeting spot. Out in a place like ours, the Walmart parking lot was the closest thing to neutral ground. When the night came, the moonshiners showed up in their old pickup trucks. They sat down with the gang leaders, ready to have a little chat. But it wasn't long before the situation escalated. As the moonshiners explained that the town was off limits, more and more pickups started rolling into the lot. Soon there were about 100 trucks roaring around, engines revving, headlights cutting through the night. Rednecks in the backs of the trucks were firing shotguns into the air and letting loose these wild, high-pitched rebel yells. The gang guys must have realized things weren't going to go their way, but it only got worse from there. In the middle of the chaos, two local kids pulled into the parking lot with police squad cars, lights flashing, sirens wailing. These weren't just any squad cars either. They belonged to two of the 4 deputies who patrolled the entire county. Turns out the kids had borrowed them from their dads, who were among the few lawmen in town. The 2 kids parked the cruisers and got out, leaning casually against the cars with the lights still flashing. The moonshiners grinned and turned to the gang leaders, saying, "Oh, don't mind the cops, they're with us." No one really knows what happened after that, but it was over almost as soon as it started. The gang guys got the message loud and clear. MS-13 never tried to set up shop in town again. What's interesting is what happened after the incident. For almost 20 years now, our town has stayed remarkably quiet. Meanwhile, the towns along the interstate, 20 miles north and 10 miles south, both have serious drug and crime problems. Things really started to go downhill in those places just a few years after the Walmart incident. But in our town, nothing. No gangs, no major drug issues, nothing. It's like the whole thing never even happened. Like the gang just decided we weren't worth the trouble. And those old holler families? They're still around. You see them driving the same beat-up pickups, hunting the same land their great-grandparents hunted, and keeping an eye on things.